Next up, let's talk about some other important programming features that we can use in the compositing tab. We're going to start with a very important tool to creating complex shows and sequences, cues. After cues, we'll jump into effects and live inputs. Let's check it out. All right, so cues are found primarily in the timeline toolbar, and it's this section right here with a bunch of flags on it. And we can see we've got 4 different plus buttons here, and each one has a different icon on it. Each one represents a different cue. So we have a play cue, we have a pause cue, we have a stop cue, and we have a jump cue. Now, each of these cues appears in this track right above our layers. Resize this a little bit so we can see that. I could always right-click in here and toggle cue pane height to hide that track if I don't want to see it. I can right-click again to bring it back down. Now, each cue is pretty self-explanatory. If the now pointer runs into a play cue, the now pointer just keeps going. It's going to run right through it. It's going to play it. If the now pointer encounters a pause cue, the timeline pauses. If the now pointer runs into a stop cue, it's going to stop the timeline, which means it unloads everything from the timeline and there's no content cached, nothing is appearing. Finally, we have the jump cue, and we can see when we're running a jump cue, there's a green now pointer that appears. This now pointer is showing us where the timeline is going to jump to when it hits that jump cue. If we go into each cue, we have a bunch of options in the inspector. I can change the time of it. I can change its number, or I can give it a label. And that label will take over in my cue pane. We can also add a note here. This note is just for you. Down here, we have some options of what this cue is. So I can change the activity state from active to ignored or ignore once. We'll see that that looks like a green square that highlights the cue a little bit when it's ignored. And if it's ignored once, same thing. We can also change that state using our timeline toolbar here, where I can click on this cue here, this little flag. It says toggle state of next cue, active, ignore. Or I can click on this next one that says toggle state of next cue with selected operation, active, ignore once. And so here I could say, hey, I want to ignore the next stop cue. So that means if I run through this, it'll ignore this stop cue and can run through to the jump cue. We can also change the cue's operation. So a cue can be any one of these 4 types. We can always change what it is. Certain cues have different things they can do. So for example, a play cue, you can add a wait duration. So I can add a wait duration of 1 second in 0 frames. And so now when we hit the play cue, it'll wait and then continue on to the next cue. Maybe we'll add a 5-second duration to make that a little more obvious. And you can see there's a countdown timer right here to the next cue on the timeline or the next action from a cue on the timeline. If we click on a pause cue, we can see we lose that wait cue. If I click on a stop cue, there's a fade duration. This is pretty handy. I can set this, and when the stop cue is activated, there'll be a 3-second fade out on the stop action before the timeline stops. One thing to note here is that if I were to, for example, make this last cue a stop cue, and let's go ahead and put a 3-second fade duration on that. When I hit this stop cue, it's just going to stop without any sort of fade. That's because the clip does not extend long enough to accommodate for that fade. That now pointer still needs something to play here. So now if I play through it, it should have that fade out in it. And indeed it does. Let's change this back to a jump cue. So jump cues have quite a few options here. The first option is I can change its mode. So I can jump to a specific type of thing, a time, a number, a label, which is another way of saying a cue, or to the next cue or the preceding cue. Some of these will give me additional drop downs. So for example, this to label, I can now put that test cue in here. And so when I jump to that test cue, we'll get that wait time, and then we'll play through. The fade duration on these jumps is also reliant on that extra clip time. So let's watch that again. So now we get that fade because we've added some extra time on the clip. Play around with these. There's a lot you can do with them that makes them pretty unique and gives you a lot of flexibility. Another thing we can do with cues is we can jump between them using these flags here that say jump to preceding cue and jump to next cue. I can also use the comma and period keys to jump between cues. Additionally, cues have this trigger other timeline parameter. So I can grab this and say trigger timeline 2. This is the jump cue. And I can say I want it to trigger a play, a pause, a stop. And I can say if I want it to be the current time, so 10 seconds, 22 frames. The trigger time, I can give it a specific time and a fade duration of that trigger. Or a cue time, so I can pick a specific cue on timeline 2, A, B, or C. So I could select, I would like to trigger cue A. And let's give that a 2-second fade duration. So now when we jump, this timeline has been triggered at QA. Additionally, there's a show timeline to trigger checkbox here, which we can press. That checkbox will show timeline 2 when that timeline is triggered, which is a nice tool if you're jumping around timelines quite a bit. The last parameter here, network command, allows us to send out some sort of API call to another device based on the settings that we put in the API. So output 1, 2, 3, or 4 correspond with outputs 1, 2, 3, or 4 here. PIXC corresponds with PIXERA control. This means that we can use cues on the timeline to trigger actions in PIXERA control, which is really handy. Some other shortcuts that we have when working with cues, I can right click in a blank area here and say select all cues or cues and clips preceding or following the now pointer. So I could say following the now pointer, which grabs all these, or I could say select all cues preceding the now pointer, which is just going to give me this one. I can also right click on a cue and fade specifically to that cue. In this case, we've triggered the other timeline there. That's why we jumped over. So I could fade to this cue. I could fade to this cue. I can also right click on a clip and add cues before or at the end of a clip. So I could add a cue. I could add a play cue right at the beginning. I could add a jump cue right at the end. Just some handy ways to quickly add cues. That will work with group select as well. So I can group select a bunch of content, bring it on to the timeline together, grab all of these and say add a pause cue right before. And now I've added a pause cue before every clip. There's also a shortcut here to rename unnamed to cue number. which will rename any unnamed queues. If there are no labels, it will automatically give them the name of their number, which can be handy if you're doing some quick programming and don't want to go through and name everything. One other thing to talk about when talking about queues is I can create a queue list by splitting my workspace, right-clicking, and adding a queue list. This queue list is a representation of all the queues on whatever timeline I have selected. So I can select a different timeline. And if I click the play button, it will jump the timeline to that queue. I can also pause it from here. So if I click on a queue, it will pause to that queue as opposed to playing to that queue. This button here will scroll my queue list if it's too small to that queue. So if I were to make my queue list really small, then when I play this queue, we'll see it pop up there. I can also take a queue and exclude it from queue list and countdown in the queue inspector, and it'll no longer show up there.